Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started for tonight. Welcome to the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame for those of you who have not been here before. We are so pleased to be able to bring this program to you. And for those of you who I have not met, my name is Diana Vela. I'm the Associate Executive Director, and am happy you've chosen to come tonight. The Soldaderas to Amazonas, Escaramuzas Chadas exhibition has been like no other, with its community involvement, support, and life just beyond these walls, including us now attending national competitions to recognize and present awards to winning teams, among many other initiatives that have come from this exhibition. And last month, we hosted Team Tierra Azteca, who is a 2023 United States champion, who are in Midlothian, by the way, and their team spoke about their history and their passions and their traditions and their frustrations, and it's available on our YouTube channel for those of you who want to further your awareness of the sport and the culture that surrounds it. And this evening is our very first opportunity to hear from the poets and the photographer whose work has touched so many, but in particular, the Chadas, who are actively competing. The Chadas are visibly moved when they see themselves represented so brilliantly in word and portrait, you know, in this dedicated space behind me and in a museum that solely exists to lift women up like them. I want to recognize a couple of special guests tonight. Dr. Amy Bell, where are you? There she is, who is at TWU, and she brought some of her students. She's the associate professor of Spanish there. And Dr. Carla O'Donnell, I know, is here. She's right there. She's on our Viva la Vaquera committee, and she is with the Department of Spanish and Hispanic Studies at TCU. So. We are very honored this evening to have on our stage Constance Jaeggi, who is the artist for Escaramuza, Poetics of Home. And clapping is absolutely encouraged. Ire'ne Lara Silva, the Texas Poet Laureate, on the end. Angelina Sáenz, the UCLA Writing Fellow and a 2024 finalist for the City of Los Angeles Cultural Olympiad. That's pretty cool. And our moderator, who is a professor at TCU, wrote the introductory panel, was an Escaramuza herself, and plug coming. She is the author, y'all, of this incredible book that you all need to go get. It's been getting unbelievable press and reviews. It's called Malus. And this evening we will be stopping the program at 7:15 so that you all will have your opportunity to come and look at all of the books, also from Angelina as well, and get your copy and get them signed. So please help me welcome Dr. Marcela Fuentes, our moderator.
Hello? Hey, there it goes. Okay. Hello, my name is Marcela Fuentes, and I'm very excited to be here as a former Escaramuza and as someone who just is so excited by the work being done by these artists and poets here. And so I guess I'm going to kick it off by asking Constance to give us a little bit of a context for the installation, maybe.
This works. Great. Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here. Very glad to have the opportunity to be able to share a little more context around the exhibition and around the room that's behind us. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how this all got started. The Cowgirl Museum reached out to, they were thinking of putting together this exhibition on Escaramuza, and they asked me if I was willing to do the photographic portion of it. And this is obviously a culture and a tradition that is not my own. So it was a very interesting process for me to be able to dive into a culture that I knew nothing about, and and to try to understand what that story was that I was trying to tell, and how to go about doing that, and how to do it in a way that gave these women a platform and did justice to their story. And so for those of you, I guess it would be helpful probably to give a little bit of context around Charrería and the place that Escaramuza holds in Charrería. So Charrería being the national sport of Mexico, it's often compared to North American rodeo. It has similar equestrian disciplines, and historically has always been an all-male sport. Women were not allowed to participate, and it's not until the 1950s that essentially the Escaramuza tradition was invented so that women had a place where they belonged within Charrería. And an Escaramuza team is made of 8 team members that ride side saddle in these beautiful traditional Adelita dresses, which are really heavy, by the way, and which you can see in the display in the front. So it's quite challenging what they have to do. And I was just amazed by the stories of these women as I started traveling around the US and speaking to them. And so this project was really about understanding what these women's experience is as women in Charrería, as Mexican American women in Charrería living in the US, often first, second, third, fourth generation Americans, and trying to honor that. And so that's what this work is essentially about.
Thank you so much. And I just want to add, it is a beautiful tradition. It's a long-standing tradition, and one that's like increasingly getting validated through being recognized as a competitive sport, and then I think recently like getting voting rights within the associations and things like that. And so it's a really wonderful thing. And I guess I'll open it up to talk about the installation, which is very much portraiture through photography and poetry that is very much inspired by both the portraiture and I think so many hours of interviews and stories of the actual team members. So I was going to ask how each artist approaches the Escaramuza tradition and how they are connected to it, through which lens, and I'll just go down the list. If we want to go poet, artist, poet, that would be great.
I have, go back. What are you asking specifically? Huh?
I'm asking how, like, what's your connection to
Okay.
the sport and like with the way that you think about the lens of your artistry that you kind of produced for this project?
So to me, a lot of things are connected to music. When people ask why I started writing, especially poetry, and they ask who my influences are, I mean, yes, there were poets I loved. Um, but for me, poetry and writing and language began in music, begins with conjunto music. Um, a lot of Ramon Ayala and Cornelio Reina and ranchera music, a lot of Jose Alfredo, a lot of lucha singing and all these different voices interpreting these beautiful songs. The rhythm of music is what I keep looking for in writing. Like, how do I find a way without music to create music on the page? And so it was interesting with this project because I guess I would say my first connection to it is not just uh, being familiar with ranchero traditions, with vaquero traditions, with all of that, but through music. I mean, I think that was probably I see horses, I hear music. I tell people that one of my lottery fantasies is that I will go everywhere. I will go to HEB, I will go to work, I will go to the post office on a horse with 3 mariachis following me so that at any point in time I can just burst into song. Like, that would be my ideal life. So I have to say that when I saw Constance's photos, I heard music. You know, I was thinking of all the ranchera music that I heard, like, you know, Golden Cinema Mexican movie, Golden Age Mexican cinema, where you had these characters that were on horseback and that would burst into song. Um, and even though, you know, I think for a lot of people, especially when they see portraits of women, expect them to be smiling or to expect them to be focusing on pretty and not necessarily on strength, not just strength and athleticism, but strength of character. Because I think that's something that Escaramuza requires and pulls out of the women that participate in it. That's sort of that strength of character. And for me, like that's ranchera music. Like that's what you hear. You hear that rawness and that strength and that trained power. And so for me, that was, I think, the entryway into coming into these poems.
I think that's so interesting because when they perform to a song.
Yes.
Like there's a song and the performance is kind of during that song. Excellent.
Okay. I guess for me, the point of entry was my relationship to horses. I come from a horse background. I've been a competitive rider for 15 years, and then I'm a photographer, and I've been photographing horses for I guess 10 years now. Time goes by really fast, and so I felt like I could do this project because I knew horses and I knew women and horses. And I'm a woman myself, and that was my entry point. And then of course I realized that I had a lot of research to do to understand what it was about the tradition, what it was about these women's stories and their experiences that needed to be shared. So it was a lot of kind of one-on-one conversations with the women that I photographed, and then a collaboration with you both to bring those voices to the forefront.
So I'm from Los Angeles. I'm from downtown Los Angeles. And I know nothing about Cowgirl or Escaramuza. What really was impactful for me was after listening to the interviews and reading the articles and watching YouTube videos was the understanding that this is a world that many, many, many women across the country are completely devoted to, and they make huge sacrifices, and in every way, financial, time, physical, family sacrifices. And what was astonishing to me is that I had never heard about it. And so what was important to me in trying to capture this narrative with the poems was to really bring to the world who they are, share with the world this phenomenon of their existence and everything that they do. When I always think about this, that in media, Latinos representation is less than 1%. And the representation that does exist is a negative stereotype of us. And so, even for me as a Mexican American, as a Latina, in a 24-hour period, how often do I get to see myself in the world, portrayed, whether in popular culture and mass media, in a positive way? And maybe I didn't come across that at all today, right? I can't see myself outside of my immediate environment. So this project for me was an aspect of my culture that I want to elevate and give visibility to. And I'm so happy that this exhibit is here and that folks get to come through and experience it. And aside from this work that we're doing, where is this being talked about, and who has an opportunity to learn about the character, like Ire'ne said, of these women?
Right. Oh my goodness, that's so great. So I'm going to jump a little bit past just the interviews with the contemporary women and kind of ask about the roots in revolutionary movements of Mexico and how that tradition translates into the Mexican American identity for women that are practicing now, if that's That's a good question, I think. I don't know.
There's two microphones. Yeah, there's one.
There.
Do we want to start with me? Okay. So at some other point, they will give you information. I'm going to give you pure opinion. So my pure opinion, I find it very interesting when we look at how history ends up influencing, inspiring, and then being changed. And how we forget parts of history. I mean, the same way that when we look at the American West, and people know cowboys, but don't realize that they're, that's based on vaquero, that's based on Mexican traditions that were there. Um, and so it's very interesting. The story of Adelitas and the Revolucion and Escaramuza is interesting. Like I said, Constance will give you background. I'm just going to give you opinion. So my opinion is that there was an incredible academic article, I think, that you forwarded to us, that talked about the changing image of Adelitas, where if you look at the historical photos, you see women that are indigenous, women that are poor. They're wearing, either they're wearing men's clothing or they're wearing very simple clothing. Because if you think about it, they're foraging for food, they're cooking, they're taking care of wounded soldiers, they are having to engage in battle. So they don't have time for the beautiful outfits and the makeup and the earrings and the accessories. They don't have time for all of that. And then you look, this article did a beautiful job of showing how as they popularized the image of the Adelita, instead of it being a woman who was fighting and who was foraging and working, they made it into a romantic figure, that the soldiers were fighting for the Adelitas because they were in love with them. They were sacrificing everything for them. And then Escaramuza comes along, and then it kind of shifts into pushing it into a very traditional sort of idea of Mexican femininity. And so some of what I found very compelling and that I had to write about was how is Escaramuza now, and how has it been through time, and what are we looking for in the future for it to change as far as gender roles and what we're expecting women to look like, act like, be like, what their participation in charreria is going to be. All of these things are what I find fascinating. So I did end up writing a few pieces to address, some of those issues, like what does it mean? And the thing that I find fascinating is that I think we said it a few times before. So all the photos that Constance has taken are all escaramuzas in the U.S. They're Mexican-American escaramuzas. You've been everywhere, from like Idaho to Washington State to Chicago to California, everywhere. But they're Mexican-American escaramuzas. So the interesting thing of what happens when you are trying to preserve culture and tradition, but at the same time still wanting to, as women, assert your right to be, to express yourself, to engage, to compete, to speak, to be.
I guess I can offer a little bit of kind of historical context for the connection between the soldaderas and the tradition of Escaramuza, but essentially Escaramuza translates to skirmish in English, and it comes from the myth that women's role in the revolution, the soldaderas, was that they were sent into battle prior to the men on horseback to kick up dust and distract the opposing side so that the soldiers could then come in and wreak havoc. So, of course, women's role in the revolution was a lot more complex than that. There were several feminist movements, and then a lot of kind of lower class women also got caught up directly in combat and had no other choice but to pick up arms or to support their men on the front lines. So the roles of these women were very complex. And as you said, history has kind of been told and retold, and those stories have shifted. But I find that connection between the soldaderas, who played a pretty large role in women's emancipation in Mexico, because it was the first time that women were stepping outside of their expected role as women in society. And so that connection connecting that with the women that I met in the US who are pushing back against some of these gender roles and gender boundaries in their sport. I think that's a very relevant connection to make, and that's something that we were aware of when creating this project, and something that we really emphasized, both in the imagery when it comes to the way I chose to photograph the women. So they're all, for the most part, confronting the camera. The gaze is really central to the way I chose to photograph them. They're asserting themselves. I photographed them in the American landscape, which is historically the domain of the white male, and they're owning that landscape. And then the poetry was another opportunity to connect, to make that bridge.
It's your turn.
Oh, I'm good.
You're good. We don't all have to share, one mic for 4 people. Just to add a little bit, I think in just anecdotal experience and doing research on my own, being on an Escaramuza team in the sort of late 80s and early 90s, at a time when there were teams, but they were very much kind of like a halftime show type thing. We were barely getting any traction. I think part of it really was, as I went back to research, that it was kind of an offshoot of post-civil rights that a lot of Mexican Americans were doing, looking for a kind of a hero, a mythos that is not sort of cowboy, but it is, and they wanted charreria, and they wanted that. And so some of the Escaramuzas kind of came from that. And I know certainly my dad was like, you're going to be on this team because it's celebrating our culture, and I'm going to go borrow a bunch of horses and get a bunch of teenagers. Let's go. And so that's kind of where that came from. If you had only met him, Ire'ne, I don't know how that would have gone. But anyway, he would have loved you. But at any rate, I was hoping that I could hear maybe some poems about these images that are kind of confronting the gaze of the viewer. I don't know. Y'all want to do some poetry a little bit? All right. I want to hand this over.
Look at our boots and spurs. No, I don't dance horses. I am not a mariachi. I am not a baile folklorico dancer. I am not the halftime show or the intermission. I am not just a pretty woman sitting on a horse that is standing still. I am a charra with extraordinary writing skills. I am sitting side saddle, drenched in my own sweat, buried in a heavy layered dress, while I control 1,000 pounds of muscles beneath me. I am enacting a dangerous, mathematically precise routine at full velocity. I have fallen off of my horse, suffered concussions, broken bones, been dragged, and trampled on. So the next time you see a woman dressed like me, look for the boots and spurs and dusty boots.
That's right.
And then you will know who I am. Obstacle Queen, give me all you've got, nothing can stop me. My horse is sick, I'll borrow another one. I don't have a place to stay, I'll sleep in my car. I get stranded on the 15 with blown out tires and my horses in the trailer. I will still find a way to make it to practice. I don't have a truck, I'll borrow it from a perfect stranger if I have to. I competed last year without owning my own horse. I still don't own a horse. Canceling practice is never an option. I always figure it out.
Amazing. I love it.
I wanted to say something about that last poem. I think it really speaks to the drive and determination that that the women that I met show when it comes to the sport, and to their their desire to keep doing it despite the challenges they come up against. And and one of the reasons why I chose to focus on the US rather than going to Mexico to photograph escaramuzas is in Mexico there's a class difference in how it's practiced in Mexico versus here in the US. In Mexico, it really is the sport of the wealthy, and there's a lot of resources around the women who ride. And the women that I met here in the US, a lot of them are moms, so they're raising kids, they're working 1 or 2 jobs or going to school full time, and they don't have a lot of means, and owning horses is expensive, and these dresses cost a lot of money. And so they're pouring a lot of resources, and sacrifice came up a lot in our conversations. They are, you know, they sacrifice a lot to be able to do what they do. And so, you know, what is it about this tradition that creates that need? And yeah, that was something worth looking into.
A couple poems. Yes? Yeah. All right. So the poems that, and I probably could have kept on going. I wrote 3 poems that are all titled What the Ghosts of las Adelitas Say in the Afterlife, as they're looking at, you know, as the ghosts are looking at the escaramuzas of nowadays. This is the second one. But how could we leave our homes, they asked. How could we take up arms, they asked. How could we leave everything behind, they asked. Why do they need to ask? Our fathers, our brothers, our husbands, our sons were killed. Our sisters, our mothers, our daughters were raped. What else was there to do but to learn to pull the trigger, to learn to use a knife, to learn to greet each day knowing it might be the last, to see our hands covered in blood and never give up? There was no space for lies, no way to deny the thinness of the wall between living and dying. We left our homes to do what we could. We left our lives to fight for what we loved. A woman who becomes a weapon never forgets what she is. And although I have some issues with history and ahistorical issues, I do think there is something in the not something, there is a lot in the escaramuzas that shares the spirit of the women of the Adelitas. There's that indomitableness, there's that strength that I think, you know, there's a tie to history that is more than just the story that is spun around it. There's something very real in that. And the last poem that I wrote, I wanted to pay tribute to what I heard in these women's voices. I tell everybody, Constance gave us a lot of homework. She gave us, 12, 14 hours of interviews that she did with the escaramuzas, several, 200, 300 pages of academic and non-academic articles, at least 80 photos, now there's more. And then we did our own research on top of that, so that was a lot of work. But the last poem I wrote is called Lo Nuestro, or What is Ours. It was the truest thing to say, a sisterhood, born of struggling and dreaming and training. It was the truest thing to say, this becoming one body, one heart, one mind, one spirit, running and whirling and wheeling about. It was the truest thing to say that it was a gift from the earth, a gift that lived on more than one land, a gift that crossed and recrossed and uncrossed and unmade borders. It was the truest thing to say that we had been made writing sisters, that we were growing up together like a family that kept branching and branching, that our children were being raised together, mothered by ants and horses. It was the truest thing to say that there are things in life that can't be renounced, because renouncing them is to surrender who we are, and surrendering has never been an option. This is life. This is life. This is our truest life.
Thank you all for sharing those poems, and especially for kind of giving some context about that sacrifice came up a lot. As I was listening, I was thinking about a time that I was I had gone to Saltillo for the Congreso Nacional, and thinking about the sisterhood and whatnot. There was an accident on the road there, and a team of Escaramuzas lost their horses. They lost, and I remember that we got there, and my dad was like, "You're gonna lend her a horse because she needs to perform." And so the rest of us from the other teams lent them horses, even though they were. And of course, I know there's a lot of horse lovers out here. They're like your dog. You love them. You love them. You have a relationship with them. And if you can imagine being, you know, maybe 15 years old and you just lost your horse and you're like, okay, I'm going to borrow a horse and I'm going to get up there and I'm going to perform. There are some very strong little girls out there. So I just want to say that. I guess like thinking about that though, what about like thinking about the passing down of culture to the next generations, not only technique, but this traditional dress and then the poetry, like that seems like the heartbeat of the project. Like, what do you feel like is the relevance of Escaramuza in contemporary culture? What do y'all think?
I think that's on the spot.
You're like, go, you go.
I'm going to read another poem and then I'm going to answer that.
I love it.
Because I think it speaks to that question. It's called 4 Generations. There is a framed photograph of my grandmother. She is a young woman sitting on a horse, vestida de China. I have another photo of my grandfather at 5 years old, dressed as a charro. My Mexican father did not introduce me to this sport. My white mother did. He was a horse jockey. She was an escaramuza. Horses have always been in our family. Today, my husband and I both perform in charrerias. We are teaching our son and daughter. Our son has started to compete. My daughter is still too young. Charreria is our gift to them. I love when I see grandpa dressed up as a charro, and then I see my parents dressed up and riding, and you see the grandkids participating, and I ask myself, is there another sport where 4 generations ride together? So I'm not sure that what does it mean for contemporary society? It's an expression, right? And we're human beings and we're expressing ourselves. What I hope will happen is that there will just get more visibility to it, particularly into the character of the athletes that represent the sport as an example for other people to follow. We just had the Olympics, and I have to admit, I was watching the Olympics and like, this is no joke. These people put everything into arriving at this moment and into competing. And, listening to the interview of all of these women and thinking they're giving every single last ounce. And it would be really great if people had the opportunity to know these stories and to become inspired by them.
Thank you.
I think there's also something about creating a sense of belonging that tradition can do, and hence the idea of Escaramuza being, hence Poetics of Home. One of the things that came up in my conversations with these women that I met a lot was the idea that they, even if they were 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Americans, they never felt American enough when they were in the US. And then when they went back to Mexico to visit family members and relatives, they didn't feel Mexican enough either. Their Spanish wasn't as good as their peers. And so it's this kind of feeling of not quite belonging in either place. And the sense that I got was that Escaramuza provided a place for them to belong. And that's where some of that drive comes from. And then I think it's also connecting. It's about connecting with your roots in a way, and I kind of see the soldadera and the image of the soldadera as providing a little extra for these women of an image of strength, an image of a strong woman from the past that they can refer to. And I think that's really important. Yeah, I think knowing that there were women before you in your culture that showed strength is something that these women can look towards.
So one of the things that really, I think that one of the first like brain explosions was that I found out that the word lienzo, which is what they call the arena space where they perform, that in Spanish that also translates to canvas. And so I thought, how amazing, you know, without knowing like these photographs, and then to think of these things, to think of Escaramuza as art. And I really feel, okay, so going back a little bit, I am very lazy. I like everything as simple as possible. I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'm not one of these people that spends 3 hours like the night before picking out accessories. Everything's black, pretty much. I would happily wear flip-flops everywhere. But I had a brother who passed away a couple of years ago. And one of the profound effects that he had on my life was that I realized that for him, there was no moment of the day and no activity in any day that should be bereft of beauty. So even though growing plants and flowers took work and effort and investment and money and time, it was worth it to see beauty. Even though I would never do this, but he would regularly spend 3, 4, 5 hours making a meal, making everything from scratch, because it was to have a meal that was beauty, that was an experience. I saw people cry over his food. I cried over his food. And I know that it's sacrilege to say that somebody cooks better than your mother. And my mother was famous for cooking, but my brother, another level. So I want to, I think, say something about how important it is to preserve beauty, to transform beauty, to bring beauty into our lives, even when it's at the cost of time and effort and all the sacrifice that we've been talking about. And that it's such a shame, I think, that when we talk about cultures mixing or cultures assimilating or people losing culture, we don't talk about the beauty that is lost and how important it is to just to hold on to beauty, for whether it's belonging or community or history, but just to keep beauty in our lives. And I mean, in everything, whether you see it in the outfits, whether you see it in the photos, in the horses, in these women, just that investment in beauty is such an important thing.
I feel like that kind of goes to, oh, Constance, do you have something else? Add it, add it.
Constance is making a request.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it, Constance.
All right, so I did write a poem titled Lienzo. What the lienzo prays every time the sun rises. They name me arena, but I am a canvas. And each movement made by a charro, an escaramuza, a horse, a bull, any beast is a stroke of paint. May the horses run as if winged. May the bulls be fierce as thunder. May the charros be as ardent as the sun. May the escaramuzas reveal their indomitable hearts. When this day is done, may everything that happened here linger in memory. Sport become art, both eternal and ephemeral.
I love that so much. I love that y'all are like, no, we're going to do another one. I love it. It actually relates very much to one of the questions here, which is tell us about the Escaramuza's pursuit of beauty and joy and excellence. And how was that to you as artists? And do you imagine that being contagious to communities that encounter it? Like, do you imagine that beauty and joy and excellence is contagious to communities? What do y'all think?
So I'm an educator. I was a classroom teacher for 23 years. And so I imagine um, students sitting, waiting, something like this, and for the escaramuzas to walk in full traje and to be able to talk about what their life is like, to show videos about what they do, to share their stories about overcoming hardship and being resourceful. And the children or the young people who are witnessing or who are experiencing that to really be touched, moved, and inspired. And I know that for me, when, like I said, even watching the Olympics this summer, um, you know, I say things to myself as I'm hearing these stories, as I was working on this project, really talking about not giving up and perseverance and setting a goal and following through and being willing to be misunderstood, because a lot of them were misunderstood because they missed so many family events. And there's kind of a stigma of, oh, I'm not even going to invite you, you're not even going to come, right? So having to deal with that. And any of us who are committed and dedicated to something that we're doing, I'm working on my PhD right now and I have to do homework, and folks are like, let's go, and I'm like, I have homework. And it's hard to set boundaries and to say, no, I'm going to do this. I think that they have so much to teach us, by the way that they live and their commitment and dedication to their sport. And I feel like anybody who is in the audience and engaging with them would definitely be inspired and kind of make a little promise in their own heart, like, I'm going to be better. I'm going to do more. I'm going to set a goal. I'm going to follow through. I'm going to overcome challenges.
I guess I'm going to speak to that from the perspective of a photographer working on this project and trying to make sure that I did the story justice. And actually, initially, the beauty, the fact that these women spend a lot of time, there's a lot of rules around what they can and can't wear and how they should be presenting themselves, because in their own words, when they wear their Aredita dress, they represent Mexico. So there's a certain rigidity and formality in the tradition and the way they present themselves that I wanted to honor and respect. But it was also a challenge because I wanted to make sure that I didn't reduce them to simply beautiful objects, which would be easy to do because they are really beautiful and colorful and perfect to look at. So I found that initially somewhat challenging, and was able to, through my conversations and through the decisions that I made on how to photograph them, I think I was able to pull out the elements that I wanted to pull out, which was their strength and their commitment, and the sacrifice and all these themes that we've been talking about, which I think are important to see in the story.
So I think all forms of art, and really this is the reason why I've dedicated myself to writing. I think all forms of art are have energy. Like, I think there's things that, okay, so there's a lot of things I don't like as far as art. Anything that's too intellectual, that doesn't have emotion in it, that doesn't have body in it, I have no reason to look at it or spend time with it or read it or listen to it. So, so because I feel like energy transfers, sometimes you see a work of art, you see a photo, you hear a song, you hear a story. Even, I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of people were watching the Olympics, because you see it or you experience it, and some of that energy transfers to you, and you're a bit electrified by being witness to it or being the one that receives it. And so for me, I think that happens with the Escaramuza. Like, I just to see, like, I believe there are Escaramuza performers that come to Fort Worth. So if y'all haven't seen them in live, go live and go see them when they're live. But you can even see them on YouTube. And I think a lot of what I loved about Constance's photos was the the way she captured that energy, that electric energy that lives in the escaramuzas. And so I think that there is, that beauty and that joy and that commitment, it transfers to anybody who witnesses the exhibit, who's willing to be affected by it, because it's there. It is a living art.
I absolutely agree. It's a living art. It's a living art that has to get practiced every day, right? You have to, and it's only a little bit of time that you're beautiful on the horse. It's mostly the dirt and the sweat and the horse's sweat and you and the coach and whoever else. So that's true. Um, I guess I'm gonna ask also, like, how do you feel like this work especially challenges stereotypes that maybe people have about Latinas or about Mexican American women? Whoever wants to answer first, I'm just handing them.
I think I'll just go back to what I had said earlier, which is that there really, as far as I'm concerned, is in a 24-hour period, not really any positive representations for Latinos. Um, and we could, have, we could be Latino, we can live in a Latino community, we could be married to Latinos. I'm talking about me leaving my home and what are the images, what are the messages that I'm getting about Latinos in a 24-hour period. And so I really don't. And so something that I'm so hungry for and that I'm always talking about is we're normal like everybody else. Why can't, like, if I look at Netflix and I'm clicking and looking for a show, there's hardly anything on Latinos. And at this point in the country, we're 1 in every 5 people, right? How could there be no representation of our culture, of our history, of our language? And so this is a phenomenal and beautiful example of our culture and our community. Um, if I ruled the world, we would be seeing examples of this all the time and in every way, shape, or form. So this is very necessary.
I think one of the positive things is not just in a contrast to those stereotypes. I think one of the strongest points of this exhibit, or one of the strongest effects, might be there are all these odd places, I think, in a person's life. I'm thinking about very young women and children. Anywhere, let's even say up to, I'm going to say up to 30, because now I'm old enough that anything under 30 is a kid. But but where you have to keep negotiating different cultures and negotiating identities and negotiating how you interact with different groups of people and negotiating how you present yourself. And if you're doing any kind of work, either a business owner, an employee of whatever, an artist of any kind, those negotiations just go to, it's constant. It's constant. And I think for people that are doing all of that work of negotiating and claiming, and to have something like this, even if it's not something that you personally have experienced, or if it's not personally in your family, to know that your community, your culture, that this is part of it, I think can be incredibly, it can make an incredible, I think, inspire an incredible sense of reinforcement of the culture, to know this is something that is there. And this is part of what I am. This is part of my history. And so I think that's one of the huge impacts that it can have, to say not just this is here, this happens, but to add beauty and to add history and to add something that you can share with others to say, this is part of what I am negotiating. This is part of why I am clinging and claiming this identity, because I don't want to, and I can't, and I shouldn't have to release it. This is who I am.
I was going to say, like, I can open it up for Q&A if anybody has questions or anything. Yes.
Request from Angelina, which talks about the Mexican-American experience. There is no difference between us.
Love it. We'll do a request. We love requests.
We wrote a lot of poems.
There are many, many, many.
There is no difference between us. You were born in Mexico, I was born in the United States. There is no difference between us. You speak Spanish, I speak English, and always need a translator. There is no difference between us. My mom is white, your mom is Mexican. There is no difference between us. You just show up to practice and then go home. I have to do everything myself before, during, and after practice. There is no difference between us. You own many horses. I don't own a horse. There is no difference between us. You compete with the horse that you trained with all year. I am on a horse that I met 3 days ago. There is no difference between us. When we are fixing to do a beautiful show, sitting on our horses in our beautiful dresses, adrenaline shooting through our body, and the love for our sport in our hearts, there is no difference between us.
Anybody else have a question or any clarification? Yes.
I just love the comment you made about when we assimilate what we lose.
And the fact is, so I wrote a very sad children's story that nobody's published yet. But I am stubborn and somebody will. But, so the brother that I was talking about, my mother passed away 23 years ago. And she was born in Crystal City, but because of the generation that she was, only went to school till the first grade, came from a Spanish-speaking community, and pretty much only spoke Spanish for the rest of her life. When she was dying, she died of cancer. She lost one sense at a time. But the first thing she lost before her vision, before her hearing, what she lost first was her ability to understand any English. And my youngest brother, who was born when she was 41, he would speak to her in English, she would speak to him in Spanish, and they'd understand each other. And they were so alike, they were so close, they loved all the same things. But it was really difficult in that last week, 8 days of her life, because she couldn't understand anything he said. After she passed away, he was 20 at the time. After she passed away, he by himself got a Spanish-English dictionary and taught himself to read and write in Spanish. He remained really shy about speaking Spanish, but he could understand it. He wrote an entire book of poetry in Spanish. And so I wrote a children's book version of all of this, how close they were, and that after she died, what I wrote is that after she died, he wrote poems in Spanish so that in heaven she would understand them. And I keep talking about the story, and the reason I'm stubborn about it is because, people talk about lost language, lost culture, lost histories, but I firmly believe that we can reclaim them. Whether it has to do with culture. For me, a big one is indigeneity. My mother was very indigenous identified. My father was very anti-indigenous identification. But I feel that we can reclaim these things. If we have the will to do it, we have the will to reclaim language and reclaim culture and reclaim connection. there are people that are willing to receive us. I am completely against people shaming other people for not knowing enough Spanish, or I don't like avocado. You don't understand how often I've heard that this is sacrilegious. But but you know, there is a will to do these things, which again, you know, comes back to the Escaramuza, that there's a will to do this and to perform this and to be this and to share this.
Any other questions? Yeah.
You said that you were in the sport as a youngster.
I was, yeah.
So, from a time perspective, how have you seen it change? What changes have come to the sport, or the way it's appreciated, or the way the participants approach?
So I feel like the sport has really proliferated. When I was a child, it was really just very grassroots. I think my dad and a couple of his friends were like, okay, we're gonna get some teenagers. Here are these 5 horses. Let's see what we can, you know, some of the kids had never been on a horse. And it was really about just trying to create an alternative to 4-H, because they wanted something that would represent the culture. And there wasn't anything there. And at the time, you know, of course, it's something very new. There's not a lot of, there certainly weren't like the rules of how this has to look and how whatever. I mean, there were definitely the beginnings of the rules, and how to have how to validate all of those things and unify them and things like that. But it was really about just getting the sport off the ground and getting girls invested. Now I see that there are teams all over the United States. They are competitive. They are competing. They're not just kind of performing, and you know, maybe you perform one day and it doesn't you know, rack up the points like you would in a competitive team. And they're everywhere. When I was a kid, of course, San Antonio, they always had an Escaramuza team, because San Antonio is a very strong heritage town for Latinos. And so a lot of times I competed on both sides. I competed in Texas, and then I was on a team in Mexico too, because I grew up in Del Rio, which is on the border. So when everyone graduated from my team, they all I was a 4th grader. They were all in high school. And they all graduated, and we didn't have any more teenagers. So my dad put me on the team on the Mexican side. They already had all of those things established, but it's really wonderful to see that in the United States, like as I think some of the interviews have shown, like it's not just in Texas and California, which are kind of the big places it happened first. It's also in Iowa, in Idaho, in Colorado. I think there's some even in Oregon, Illinois. So anywhere you see Latino communities, and you don't have to even be a Latino to compete, like you really don't. And it's just the proliferation that I think is so beautiful. And you don't have to be someone with a lot of means. You can, you know, borrow somebody's horse. You can do a lot of car washes and bake sales, which is, I used to do that too. But so I see the sport changing. And I think Constance, maybe you can answer this too a little bit. Like, I think that they're even getting a voice in some of the association voting and things like that, right? I think.
So when we started the project, within the Charrería, the Federación, within the governing association, women were not allowed to vote on their representatives, and that has since changed. So I think there's, you know, so back to what you were saying about culture and what happens when people grow up with 2 cultures, and there's some pushback. And so what, you know, some of the things that these women were telling me was they were rebelling against this lack of representation and the lack of the voice. And but those things are changing. So there's progress.
It's called Malas. It is a historical novel. It's also a music novel, so a lot about conjunto, a lot about the Texas-Mexico border. Obviously, the title is Malas, so the women are messy and not good people. It is about 2 women, a family being cursed, and also a teenage girl who wants to be in a punk band. So yeah, if you like messy people doing messy things, and maybe a good playlist. There is a playlist that goes with it. Check it out. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, absolutely. That is my audience plant, strategically placed in the front there. That's yes. It was a Good Morning America book club pick for June, and I was very excited. It is my first book, so yes. I don't have the prolific. I don't know. She's like a writing machine over there. I'm like, I just have the one. I don't know. But please, anyone who has questions or wants to come get anything, we can. I have a little tap thing, or we'll take cash. I think all of us will. Anyway, yes, thank you.
Oh, good. Good question. Constance?
There is a catalog that's for sale in the gift shop that has all the poems and the images. And
tell them the exciting news about next year.
And there is a book. We're working on a book that's being published by Gost Books that should be out hopefully July of next year.
Coffee table book.
Coffee table book, yep.